The UN Secretary-General is under growing pressure to act on Ukraine and bring the two sides to the negotiating table. A group of more than 200 former senior UN officials have written to Antonio Guterres warning him that unless he intervenes personally and quickly, the UN could be doomed. We have to decide to raise our voice out of concern for the existential challenge the United Nations is facing in this historic juncture, said the signatories. We implore you to intensify your personal efforts for the cessation of hostilities and conflict resolution through peaceful means. We are horrified at the alternative, the UN becoming increasingly irrelevant and eventually succumbing to the fate of its predecessor, the League of Nations. Today, he responded with action, asking the Russian President Putin and President Zelensky to receive him to discuss steps to bring about peace as soon as possible. So let's discuss this with Andrew Gilmour. He was one of the signatories of that letter. He spent 30 years working at the UN, most recently as Assistant Secretary-General for Human Rights. He's now the Executive Director of the Berghoff Foundation, and he joins us from Berlin. Thanks very much for being with us on the programme. I was looking back at the UN Charter that was signed in San Francisco in 1945, and this is what it includes in the first two articles of that charter. Article 1, equal rights and self-determination of people. Article 2, all members shall settle international disputes by peaceful means. And it also goes on to say that there should be the prohibition of threat or use of force in international relations. So if they're not meeting that bar, have they failed?
Absolutely, and they have failed many, many times. But the fact that the member states who are members of the United Nations and signed that noble charter in 1945, the fact that they very often don't live up to their expectations is no reason why those who work for the UN, such as I did for 30 years, as you pointed out, it doesn't mean that we shouldn't do the utmost in our power to try to persuade them to do better.
Do we take it from the fact that you signed the letter that you don't believe the Secretary-General is doing enough?
I mean, nobody actually really wants to criticize the Secretary-General. He does wonderful work on development, on refugees, and says great things on climate change and the sustainable development. But there is, as you read them out, the key point of the United Nations from its very beginning was to save succeeding generations from the scourge of war. That means stopping or preferably preventing wars. And every Secretary-General since 1945, when there has been war, either just before it starts or after it starts, make major efforts to try to stop it. And we are very much hopeful that the current Secretary-General will do what his predecessors always did.
It's clearly stung the Secretary-General into action because he's now written to the two parties, to the Russian president and the Ukrainian president. What do you want him to do? And what power does he really have?
He has a lot of moral power. And this is a very important point. In terms of legal power, perhaps not as much. But when you say, what should he do? Let's just take a very quick look at some of the predecessors. In 1956, Dag Hammarskjöld did his utmost to stop the Suez War. U Thant worked behind the scenes with Khrushchev and Kennedy on the Cuban Missile Crisis. And then in the 1967 war, Ban Ki-moon did on many issues. Both Perez de Cuellar in 1991 and Kofi Annan in 1998 both went to Baghdad to plead with Saddam Hussein to pull back. Now, they both knew that they were rather making fools of themselves by doing so, because the odds of Saddam Hussein doing what they wanted him to do was always very small. But they took the view that it didn't really matter. It doesn't matter if their personal esteem suffers or if they're made to look a bit ridiculous. The point is to try. And frankly, even the person generally considered as the worst ever Secretary-General, Kurt Waldheim, during the 1973 war between Israel and Egypt and Syria, within 2 weeks, he was telephoning Henry Kissinger, the US Secretary of State, and within days, UN peacekeepers were put between the conflicting armies, and similarly when the Iran-Iraq war. So every Secretary-General has in the past made major efforts, as I said, going to the ground, going to the area in question, reaching out systematically to the parties, leaving no stone unturned to try to stop an appalling war. And that is something that we all think the 200 signatories, and by the way, many more have asked unfortunately, they were too late. They didn't know about the letter, have asked to sign it. And I can tell you that there are literally hundreds, almost certainly thousands of current UN staff members who feel exactly the same way.
It's a really important point you made because, of course, Emmanuel Macron has made great efforts to engage with President Putin and he has been criticised for it. And of course, that brings political risk. But the Secretary General doesn't have an electorate. He doesn't face the same political risk, so he can take more chances. But I guess a lot of people would say the party that is really making a fool of the UN is the Russian member of the Security Council. Why is Russia still part of that Security Council when they've relinquished their right to sit as part of the international community?
Because, and ironically, it was part of Ukraine at the time, in the 1945 Treaty of Yalta, FDR, Roosevelt, Winston Churchill, and Stalin decided on what the rules of the Security Council were going to be, including the right of veto. And there they decided that these countries, and two more were added, Russia and China, would have the right. And any one of those five can veto any changes in the rules. So that is why we're in that situation we're in now. It's very simple. They have the veto power and they are going to use it to ensure that there is no Security Council resolution against what they're doing. Moreover, there will be no change in the Security Council rules to enable that to happen.
Lani, Andrew and the fellow signatories of this letter are spot on. We talk about it a lot on this programme. This is a moment of existential threat to the UN. And Donald Trump talked about it. He talked about withdrawing funding from the UN because it doesn't achieve what it sets out to do. Do you see the importance of the moment for the Secretary General?
Well, the moment is critical, and I think what we're seeing more than anything else is the impotence of the United Nations and the challenge that comes with multilateral organizations, because we've seen this over the last several decades. When individual countries are able to effectively advance their parochial agendas through multilateral organizations. For example, what China did at the outset of the COVID-19 pandemic with respect to the World Health Organization, what we see Russia's ability to do now with respect to the UN Security Council and blocking any meaningful action. Yes, the UN Secretary General should absolutely be a peacemaker. He should step out. But the challenge is, even were he to do that, there is no enforceable mechanism behind which the UN activity or any UN activity would potentially be able to have true impact. And I think that's why you see so many in the United States questioning, and this is both Republicans and Democrats, questioning the efficacy of the UN, but more importantly, questioning how involved the U.S. can be or should be in the UN, as opposed to engaging in multilateral activity or bilateral activity that it itself sort of initiates and brokers. So I think the UN fundamentally is a damaged and challenged organization, particularly at this point in time. We're seeing just how, as I noted earlier, how impotent really the organization is.
Tom, just a very quick mention. I saw a story today that two zookeepers who stayed behind in Kharkiv to feed the animals were executed in the bathroom of the zoo, holding a bucket of carrots and some dog food. And this is the point. He is terrorising an entire nation, Vladimir Putin, and he's not a broker for peace. And so it doesn't matter if the Secretary General goes to Moscow.
Well, that was what I thought was interesting about the letter, actually, because what can the UN do if Russia has no interest in negotiation, mediation? But what the letter said, and I was very interested in this part, is that it was after the Cuban Missile Crisis and in the Gulf War in 1990, it was the UN that was there to do the mediation. And in this conflict, there's been mediation in Turkey, the Gulf states have been involved. Now, none of us can look into our crystal ball and know where the conflict will end, but at some point, there will presumably have to be some mediation. Who knows between who knows how far into the future it will happen. But the UN should be the ones who are there to do the mediation when it happens. Yeah. And I can see why former staff have crossed that they've maybe let that slip a bit.
OK, we'll have to leave it there. Andrew Gilmour, we're very grateful for your time. Thank you for coming on the programme. Do stay with us. Plenty more to come.